Hey everybody, and welcome to another episode of Knocked Conscious. Today I had the pleasure of speaking with James Burling. He's the Vice President of Legal Affairs for the Pacific Legal Foundation. It was a great conversation. Here it is. I hope you enjoy it. I've got a face for a radio, so I'm not too worried about it. Most people don't look at me, so welcome. So James, you were at Freedom Fest, correct? And you were part of the panel. Let me pull the
That's
panel up because I
correct.
want to make sure it's correct. How
Yes.
government created the housing crisis and what we can do to fix it. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Excellent. And you are the VP of Legal Affairs for the Pacific Legal Foundation. Is that correct?
Correct.
Excellent. Well, welcome to Not Conscious, sir. I was at Freedom Fest and I met you. I believe we crossed paths a million times because I was running around from room to room. Unfortunately, I did not see your panel. I was at the How Nations Escape Poverty panel. So I apologize that I missed yours, but I'd love for you to tell us about yourself, who you are, tell us about your organization and Freedom Fest and any of the topics you want to start with, because we have topics aplenty, sir.
Absolutely. So we started out. I'm James Burling. I am the Vice President of Legal Affairs at Pacific Legal Foundation, and I have been at Pacific Legal Foundation for a little over 40 years now, litigating property right cases, primarily environmental cases, all on behalf of property, and of course, all pro bono. And what our goal is to create precedents in the appellate courts and the Supreme Court that will positively affect property owners across the country, just not the individual case that we have. And pretty successful. We have won 18 of our last 20 cases at the Supreme Court. And I think that's a track record that I'm happy about. I argued one of those cases. I was director of litigation and overseeing a number of the other cases over the years. We do specialize and have had quite some success in representing individuals at the Supreme Court. And I don't mean friend of the court only. I mean 20 cases people at the Supreme Court. And our belief is that property rights are really critical to all our freedoms. I mean, you may have heard this before, it's been said, but it can't be repeated too many times. What if government owned the printing presses? How could there be a free press if you have to get a permit from government to do everything? What if the government owned the churches? How could churches freely express their religion? Otherwise, you could be a nation like China that has lots of churches, but you all have to have Chairman Xi in the background, above Jesus or Muhammad, or you would Muhammad, but in large.
North Korea is a good example as well, I'm sure.
Absolutely. And so, and to the point of what we deal with in property rights and housing, there are people that say, look, the government should own all housing. But if government owns housing, or at least all low-income housing, how can people in that housing really and argue that their government is doing something wrong when they could be punished through their housing? So I think freedom to own and use property, freedom to rent property without governmental interference is critical to all of our freedoms. And so that's kind of the core of what Pacific Legal Foundation has done over its 51 years in existence. And I like to think that we have contributed positively to freedom in America.
It's a beautiful cause. So I watched a couple previous podcasts with you on it, and you got into this very early, but my understanding is you got into it not actually on this side. You kind of got on from the other side. Is that correct?
Well, not necessarily. I mean, I started as a productive member of society. I was a geologist, and I did exploration geology.
That's right, geology. That's right.
But when I was in school growing up, I read the New York Times and I believed what I read. And I was, fairly oriented. But when I started working for a living, and especially when I started as a geologist and seeing how the public lands were being mismanaged by government, and seeing how government was taking away from individuals the freedom to use their property. They had inholdings within a national forest, or whether they were neighboring federal land, or whether they had timber leases or cattle leases. grazing leases from the federal government, see how the federal government was terribly mismanaging the lands. And I had a number of epiphanies. I realized that, more government is not necessarily better. Government is making things worse on the public lands. And I decided eventually, I was inspired by some federal bureaucrats I had to deal with, to go to law school to fight that kind of thing. And I went to law school with a purpose of fighting bureaucracy. And I got my dream job 41 years ago, for Pacific Legal Foundation to do that. So yeah, I started out kind of on the left, a series of epiphanies, and I think I'm right in the middle right now. I strongly believe in the values that all Americans are entitled to rights and all Americans should have opportunities in the country, but not necessarily equality of outcome, certainly, because when you try to do that, you shoehorn people into places they might not belong, and you're being unfair if you try to guarantee outcomes, but guarantees of opportunity, I think, are critical.
I think that's a beautiful way to say it. A couple things from what you just shared. Sean is a gentleman I befriended recently. He's on a podcast called Buds in Reality, very libertarian minded, and he's got this great quote. It's just, no one starts out a libertarian. We come to this epiphany through experience. I'm a grade A neocon from the right. So you came from your side, I came from my side. For example, Rechtenwald was the libertarian nominee up until the point he wasn't. He's a Marxist, so none of us have started out. Usually we've started out with some ideology that was implanted and ingrained in us over time, that we have kind of been brainwashed, that we had to deprogram over all this time. How is it that you had gotten it so early in your mind from such a short time? Because it took me 20, 30 years. I'm still working on the deprogramming.
Yeah. I mean, I had an inherent distrust of government growing up in the 60s. I was born in 54. The Vietnam War consumed my early years. And I had a growing distrust of what the government was doing in Vietnam. I understand that we wanted to stop communism. I certainly understand to this day that communism is a very bad thing. But the way we are going about it, and the way we're using American youth as cannon fodder to fight a war that we didn't want to necessarily win, or we wouldn't win, seemed to me to be wrong. So, I mean, that there's a liberal zeitgeist at that time. If you're opposed to the Vietnam War, then you have to buy into all these other liberal ideas. And I fell within that trap, if you will.
Which we all do, because you have to get labeled. I mean, you have to pick a side, right? It really is this duopoly, which is really a uniparty kind of piece now, but it really was a left-right kind of ideology. Because I was Iraq. I got pulled in through Iraq. I even enlisted, so I failed the physical, but I enlisted. So it was one of those things where I was bought into defending freedom, defending democracy. And now
these are wonderful ideas, defending freedom, defending democracy. These are good things, but it doesn't necessarily mean government knows the best way of going about it. In fact, it often doesn't, because larger government gets, and the bigger and more monolithic our government gets, I think the less it is able to understand the principles that underlie that government. You look at what our founding fathers were concerned about back in the 18th century, in the late 1700s. I mean, they viewed with a philosophy of people like John Locke and Montesquieu, realizing that the government was tyrannical, and they did their level best to prevent our government from becoming tyrannical. But the problem is, we have so many good intentions. We want government to do so many things: protect ourselves from famine, protect ourselves from crop failures, protect ourselves economic dislocation, protect the rest of the world from forces that are malevolent in some ways. And we take on this mission creep of the federal government, where it becomes more and more powerful, more and more controlling of our lives. And the only way that you can have a government that runs, that has so many things going on, is to control the people that it is governing, rather than people who are being governed control that government. And so there is this real inexorable trend that as government gets larger, people's rights necessarily get smaller. I mean, it's not to the point that we've gotten to some dictator. I think Stalin understood well that you have this great ism, this great idea of communism, but it doesn't work in human nature. So you have to kill off a lot of people, right? You have the,
Right.
you kill off and starve a lot of the kulaks in Ukraine, or Pol Pot kills everybody who's educated, or in North Korea, you just get rid of people and you put them into concentration
Or the
camps.
Germans.
The
I mean, the
Germans
Germans,
and the Jews,
they all had one enemy that they could focus on within their population that they could find.
and sometimes when you get rid of one enemy, you have to find another. But it's because nature doesn't conform to one particular box. You can't, everybody doesn't fit into it. Everybody's different. And that's very problematic for a government that wants to control everything, because some people be controlled. They don't fit into the boxes. So as Pacific Legal Foundation does its litigation, looking for those people that really don't fit in within that government box. They want to use that the local government doesn't want them to use. They have land that has been declared some kind of habitat, but they want to run cattle on that land. They want to do something with it. And they aren't willing to be controlled and simply say, yes, sir, whatever you say you're doing with my land, I want to do. So we go to court and we litigate. And fortunately, in this country, courts remain fairly powerful. Courts are a for our freedoms that don't exist in other courts. I mean, we talk about the Soviet Union years ago. They had a wonderful constitution. I mean, I love reading their constitution and all the rights are given to the people. There were some exceptions, but by and large, it's a great constitution. It wasn't worth the paper it was written on, because you could not enforce those rights against a dictatorship. This country, we still have the hope of going to court. It's not easy, not cheap, it's not short, it's difficult. And we have to warn our clients that, before you begin this is going to be a long process. It's going to take quite some time. But if you stick with it, you have the chance of advancing freedom in this country. Just a bit, maybe quite a bit, if the case goes really the right way. So that's what we try to do.
It's a beautiful thing. So do you work with just land property, or with like cattle as property and those types of other pieces?
We primarily deal with land, but there are other properties, because property embraces a lot of different things, not only real property, not only personal property, but I love, my favorite essays is James Madison's essay on property that he wrote into the New Republic. And he talks about property in expansive terms. Property being the right to the way you want, the right to have the job you want. All these things he considered part of our property. And I take this expansive view of property. And other times the Supreme Court is, these things are not disconnected. They're not atomistic things. You have your property here, your personal property here, your rights over here. They're all intertwined. And if you start picking some away, the whole bundle is going to fall apart. So, we focus on real property because that's what our bread and butter is, and that's where some of the strongest abuses are, but exclusively.
And the reason I was asking that, for example, is Thomas Masson's been behind that act about tagging cattle. And we know the reason for this is for these control mechanisms, and it's complete governmental control to know where everything's going, how it's being knowing, oh, we're going to call, the odd number tags today because there's some fake flu or epidemic going around that we need to do something about. I'm curious if you had any business with any of those types of cases.
No, we have not been directly involved in those kind of cases. I think they raise a very interesting point. And let me go back to the 40s, where there's a case called Wickard versus Filbert, 40s and early 50s, where a Kansas farmer was prohibited from growing wheat on his own property for his own personal consumption. And Congress tried to control that and the Supreme Court said it was okay, because if he didn't have his own wheat to consume, he'd buy it on the market. Therefore, he had an indirect effect on the market. So government, when they talk about tagging cattle or telling you that you can't grow wheat on your own property, It is really a control mechanism. So the people that are worried about, cattle or might be confiscated, well, wheat was confiscated, right? You couldn't sell wheat. You couldn't control your own wheat. Will we not be
Hemp,
able to
for
consume
example,
our own cattle?
hemp was illegal for all that time when hemp was being grown in Jefferson's and Washington farms, for example. I know
Yeah,
that became an illegal crop as well.
Yeah, and we find new boogeymen, new things that are wrong, new things we want to control. I mean, temperance movement and the pro are classic examples that things you try to control, you can't control. And so maybe you should think of a better way of trying to control the population, like not not trying that. So I think what we see in government is, as I said out, yeah, so an exorable growth curve, because this is what people seem to want, right? We're going into an election now, and one of the parties is talking about nationwide rent control. We're going to make sure everybody has a free lunch for everybody's going to have a free lunch, and so on and so forth. So all these programs, they're not cost free. And when I say they're not cost free, I'm not talking about cost in economic terms, in tax dollars only. They have a cost on our freedom in some degree, fashion, or another. Sometimes you can't anticipate what the freedom cost will be from a program, but they're there. I mean, rent control, what's that going to do? If you have nationwide rent control, it looks, only in big corporations now that have only more than 50 properties, but you know how long those limits will be there. So be everybody. Soon you will have eviction moratoria like we had during COVID, where landlords cannot rent. So what's that going to do? People are going to get out of the rental business. They're going to stop building rental properties. That's happening already. More and more pressure for government housing projects. Soon we'll have more and more government housing projects, because nobody's going to want to build housing in an environment where there is pervasive rent control or threat of rent control. That's a property that we've been involved in for a long time, fighting incursions on the ability of people to rent property at market prices, because it has such a severe impact on housing. And that's things in this book that I wrote that I talked about at Freedom Fest, Nowhere to Live, The Hidden Story of America's Housing Crisis. I talk about all these things that combine together to create disincentives for people to build homes near where people want to buy them, causing a limit on supply, but demand remains strong. So prices go up and up and up. People can't afford homes. People end up on the streets and sidewalks across our cities like never seen before. And the solution is not more government. The solution is less.
And that's certain. And what we're seeing is more, what I'd like to see is more of a late stage capitalism, in the fact where it's been corrupted, where it's come full circle now and infested the government. We're watching Boeing has 2 astronauts stranded on a space station right now. I mean, what Alex Jones was fined 4 times what Boeing Corporation was fined, and they killed 700 people with their software that they put on those planes. That's just a fact. I know the weight and balance. I'm a pilot, actually, so I studied very much into that. It's pretty crazy. I'll make that bold claim. I'm fine. I'll take it. I'll take any heat that I get for that. But it's just unbelievable. We're watching this. So when we watch it come full back around, you're seeing this. When COVID hit, the first thing was 100 employees or something. I called my employer and I said, I am not taking the vaccine. If I need to stay home the rest of my life, I am not taking this vaccine. And he said, I'm not worried it's not going to get to our size. I go, it's going to get to our size, because we're letting it get to this size. Because the second that crack starts, everybody wants to rip it even further apart. And it takes 10 times the effort to rescue or retract something once it's been implemented.
Yeah. And I think if you want to create vaccines, great. If people want to take them, great. Look, I have a 103-year-old, and so I will take the vaccine just on the infinitesimal chance that it might save her life. To do that, I know there's a risk, but it's a risk I'm willing to take for her. But nobody should ask me to do this. Nobody should tell me that I can't go into a restaurant, I can't get on an airplane, I can't get on a train, I can't go to public. In fact, I have to stay home and isolate myself for the next 3 years or whatever. Taking away personal choice. And yeah, I understand the argument that, well, if enough people get the vaccine, it'll spread more. But we have to realize that just because the greater public wants something doesn't mean that we all fit in the same box. So if you want to take the vaccine, more power to you and anybody else out there. But it's not my choice to tell you to take it or not to take it. It's you say, hey, it's available. It's your choice, not mine.
Yeah, and that's kind of where we're at. So I keep throwing curveballs at you because I'm infinitely curious. Obviously, you've spoken about what you know so well and all the property pieces. Have you ever dealt with any water rights cases? Because we're seeing a lot of corporations like Walton's buying up the Colorado River, buying up California water left and right. Idaho has now implement or stopped allowing farmers on their own water to use their own wells that they've dug, things like that. Have you dealt with any of those types of
we've dealt a bit with property rights and related to some grazing cases where the Forest Service told people, well, yeah, water right, but you just can't get to it. You can't put a pipeline to get the water to your ranch, and therefore your water's worth nothing. But yeah, when you have a limited resource, West, water is certainly a limited resource. Many people have rights, but when they become scarcer, many more people want those rights. And what you are seeing with corporate taking over or a government taking over water rights is a sense that, you know, who's in power gets the rights, those who lack the power. You can see that in all kinds of contexts. You see that in domain where small property owners get their property taken for some redevelopment project that's a of the local politicians. You'll see that in people trying to build homes on the coast of California, where the Coastal Commission makes it virtually impossible. So those the homes see their values go up and up and up, and they got what they want and keep everybody out. So there's very much in this property rights arena and the water rights kind of a big guy versus little guy zeitgeist, where the who are in power acquire what they can any way they can, and that I think the courts are the only and sometimes not a very good hope, but they're the last hope out there. Oftentimes, yeah, it's kind of small sometimes.
Help me, SCOTUS. You're my only hope.
Yeah, I mean, we look. We have the best Supreme Court that I've had.
Hey, look, it's
practicing law.
The best system we're gonna have. I mean, what you can't. There's no perfect system. There's no perfect system.
No, there can't be a perfect system. Certainly not for a country.
And that's why you want to limit the powers as much as possible, because it's so imperfect, because it's fallible. You don't want to. You just want to limit its reach, its scope, its ability to affect everyone so greatly. That's all. It has nothing to do whether it exists or not. It's just whether it's powerful or not.
Yeah, and that's bottom line libertarian philosophy. We all disagree about many things, right? And what should be banned and who should ban it.
Even within the libertarian philosophy, with this,
absolutely. I mean, no two libertarians can get in the same room and agree on everything. But that's the beauty of this country, that we can still get along and we can still try to achieve our goals, as you know, in different ways, and the goals are very to some degree. But we all have a skepticism. That is all the libertarian things, and I'm not a pure libertarian. Okay, fine. But
I think it's very hard to do that.
Yeah,
hard to be pure.
I mean, you look at the. I won't talk about where the Libertarian Party is right now and what the
please do. No. I just did a podcast with Rechtenwald. We literally dished about the Libertarian Convention. We talked about all of it. They are not happy with me right now, so I have no issue with you sharing anything you'd like to share. But I also don't want to put you on the spot, so please feel free to share what you like.
It's not. I am not close enough to have observed enough, except from a distance, and I just shake my head and say, what are these guys doing to themselves? And that's about all I can
split right down the middle. Yeah, it was an it's an interesting thing. It's literally like 50.1 49.9. It is almost right down that middle there.
Right.
For sure.
Well,
so
hopefully when the dust settles, something will come out of it. But I think
I'm actually concerned. I'm concerned that they really dealt themselves a death blow, to be honest. I'm very concerned with the candidate that they ultimately chose is going to hurt them net, because the people that come to that realization that they come to protect children above all. Just that simple. There's no other way around it. Children come first, foremost, and everything. So it's just one of those things.
Yeah, I saw the
Yeah,
candidate speak at Freedom Fest, and I was anyway. I won't go there.
Yeah, no worries.
It
Like I said, I've had my conversations with them as well.
Yeah, but you know,
So what I'd love for you to share, if you could. Go ahead. You had a point.
No, I guess my point is that you know we're going to be stuck with one way or the other, one of the major parties, right? So we have to figure out how to deal with that party. So you know, a little aside, back in 2016, when it looked like Hillary Clinton was going to win by a landslide,
92-8.
Yeah, I was director of litigation at Pacific Legal Foundation, and what I just racking my brain is I said we're going to lose the Supreme Court. Somebody far more liberal and worse, Merrick Garland, if that's possible, is going to be in the Supreme Court. We're going to have retirements on our side, just aging out. And what are we going to do as a litigation group to deal with a hostile Supreme Court? So this is what I was thinking up until a few hours into election night eve. And I said, oh my God, we have an opportunity here. Perhaps the opportunity of a lifetime. And indeed, that's where we are. Again, not a perfect institution. Not everybody fits right in my mold on the Supreme Court. Some are better than others. You know, shout out to Justice.
There are net better, right? I mean, we can't, like I said, we gotta pick with what we have, right?
Yeah, and what we have now is really a court, which is why the media and the left is so focused on trying to distract everybody, trying to delegitimize the court. We've always had people.
They're talking about packing it. They're talking about shortening term. Yeah, they're talking about a bunch of things.
We're talking about having them just torn ethics complaints that anybody could file an ethics complaint. You look what happened to Judge Cannon, 1,000 ethics complaints against her. And the Court of Appeal finally had to shut them down, saying no more complaint because they want to destroy her. They want to destroy the U.S. Supreme Court because they can't control it. During the court of the Warren Court years and the Burger Court years, people like me were upset with the court. We thought the court was destroying precedents, with doctrines that just had no basis in the Constitution. And it's a trend that had been going on since the New Deal. And now finally, for the first time in almost a century, the court's come back around, I think, closer to first principles than it has been in a long time. And I'm quite happy about that. But as you can see, the people who are statists, who really want to have government agencies control everything, are very upset. They realize they can't win in litigation at the Supreme Court anymore. So they're going to try to destroy the court one way or the other so they can have power back.
Yeah. So to that, we're talking SCOTUS. So there are a couple recent rulings. I would assume the Chevron deference really must have opened up some cases that you could pursue now. Now that it's going to be retroactive.
Yeah. I mean, Chevron deference is a curious beast. Back when,
would you like to share a little bit about that, just to kind of explain it from a layman's term to a lot of people, because people think Chevron, they think the gas, obviously it has to deal with a case, but what does it mean and what are those implications?
Back when Chevron was first adopted many years ago, 40 years ago or so, what happened was that the EPA was somewhat middle of the road, and it had a regulation dealing with power plant pollution. And the idea was you'd put essentially a miracle bubble over the power plant. So if you fixed one of the boilers to make it less, that would be a good net gain overall, and you wouldn't have to then boiler over again. But a court of appeal said, no, you can't do everything in a bubble. If you have to get a permitting for the plant, you have to look at everything in the plant, in every permit, every stack, have less pollution and meet the standards than it did before. Well, that made no sense. It was counterproductive. But a court of appeal agreed with the environmentalists, the National Resource Defense Council, that the lawsuit, and they struck down the rule and essentially wrote their rule themselves, the Court of Appeal. And so the Supreme Court legitimately said, wait a second, Court of Appeal, you can't be writing legislation. And said, oh, you have to defer to the agency. And so the Supreme Court legitimately said, wait a second, Court of Appeal, you can't be writing legislation. And said, oh, you have to defer to the agency. And said, oh, you have to defer to the agency. And said, oh, you have to defer to the agency. And said, oh, you have to defer to the agency. And said, oh, you have to defer to the agency. And said, oh, you have to defer to the agency. And said, oh, you have to defer to the agency. And said, oh, you have to defer to the agency. And said, oh, you have to defer to the agency. And said, oh, you have to defer to the agency. And said, oh, you have to defer to the agency. And said, oh, you have to defer to the agency. And said, oh, you have to defer to the agency. And said, oh, you have to defer to the agency. And said, oh, you have to defer to the agency. And said, oh, you have to defer to the agency. And said, oh, you have to defer to the agency. And said, oh, you have to defer to the agency. And in that particular case, it kind of made sense. But the problem was the agencies soon realized that if the courts had to defer the agency interpretations of the law and there were no checks on that, the agencies could become and did become very, very creative in expanding the power for what they could regulate and the way they could regulate it and the standards they would regulate with. And so the agencies began to arrogate all kinds of power that were not part of their congressional mandates. And that's when people began
And
to
then you'd
realize.
have things like the FDA. The FDA person would be coming right out of big pharma and go right into the FDA and have that revolving door. You'd have the, you know, those big, you know, the big pharma, the institutions would then be corporatized by the people who are running those institutions, and then they would be able to write those own laws per them being the experts now.
I mean, it's classic Gordon Tullock, the Nobel laureate, talking about rent seeking. The idea is that when you have a regulatory regime that has great power over an industry, the industry is going to get smart and do whatever it can to go in and control and regulations being written. And that'll happen whether it's the big pharma or whether it's the environmental industry. The environmental industrial complex are people that make tens, hundreds of millions of dollars through fundraising for the environment. They have a stake. So everybody has a stake of going to the agency and getting more power shunted their way, whether it's this environmentalist here, this industry player here. Rent seeking is all about what naturally follows from government having power over something. When government has power over something, those that it has power over will try to bend regulations their own way. And what that means is the big guys are the ones that make in the end. The little guys.
We're finding that with the internet. We're clearly finding that with the internet. Look, we're finding that for example, East Palestine's a great example. The wheel bearing system was from the 1800s. If regulations were about safety, I think they would have addressed an 1800s wheel bearing system, right? You know, it clearly wasn't. Regulations aren't to protect; they're to keep new industry out. We're finding, right? Because these companies buy the lobbyists to write legislation that prohibits new growth, prohibits competition, not actual safety for us. They just frame it that way. They manufacture that consent.
Yeah, and in my book, Nowhere to Live: The Hidden Story of America's Housing Crisis, I talk about rent seeking, and I talk about Gordon Tullock a little bit. In lay terms, talk about in the context of eminent domain, for example, you're given tremendous power over redevelopment agencies. They get to pick and choose what areas of the city they want to have control over. They get to pick and choose what areas get demolished, which is usually working class neighborhoods that don't have the political clout to stop it, and they get to choose what kind of favored project. I mean, I talk about Pole Town in Detroit. It was a ethnically mixed neighborhood, but it was a great neighborhood, lots of churches, lots of businesses, but the city thought it would be much better for a big General Motors plant. And Pole Town was razed, and I have some pictures of Pole Town in my book, Nowhere to Live, and it was replaced by a General Motors plant, which a couple later was abandoned because it made no sense for General Motors to continue that. And you talk about the Kelo case out of Connecticut, where the city fathers got together with pharmaceutical and they destroyed an entire middle-class neighborhood to make way for Pfizer pharmaceutical headquarters. And then Pfizer, of course, leaves a decade later. So it's kind of renting on the local level where a powerful entity.
Wasn't there a Snapdragon, or isn't there a Snapdragon communications chip manufacturing plant that got all hundreds of millions of dollars, didn't even break ground, and now they've already abandoned it?
Yeah, I mean, it had happened all the time that huge amounts of money are shoveled out at some favored industry, not because.
And we don't look at the hidden cost. For example, I'm in Phoenix. We have a light rail system. And as they're building the light rail system, all the businesses up and down that light rail system are being directly affected because people are not going through the hassle of navigating through the traffic or whatever, the potholes, whatever, to get to said business or whatnot. So restaurants closing down up and down because they only have half the access now because the light rail's in the way, things like that. It's pretty interesting.
And government generally will not compensate people for that. I've been in so many eminent domain cases where I think to myself, why aren't they just doing the right thing and paying people for the property that they're taking, paying full value for property rather than trying to nickel and dime? And I go in Nowhere to Live. I go into stories. Here's a horror story for you. Florida Everglades. The Park Service went around to communities and said, we want you to rezone the property because it's going to protect nature. Then the Park Service comes in behind and condemns that property to expand Everglades National Park. But then they said, well, property wasn't worth too much because it was rezoned at lower use at our behest. So they go in, had it rezoned so they could get it for cheap. And then the second part of the puzzle is they would condemn maybe a dozen parcels of property at a time. If anybody had the wherewithal to get an attorney to represent them, to argue that their fair market value was what it was, the federal government would dismiss those people with attorneys, and then they would bludgeon the people without attorneys into accepting a low price. Then they would go after the people with attorneys and said, well, what is market price? Market price is what we pay to those people without attorneys. And
right, and that's what comps are, right? So they've already comped the market by buying at the lower price.
By manipulating the market. Yeah, and this is the case.
Well, it's like the housing crisis in California. These guys are getting paid six figures to solve the crisis. Of course, they're not going to solve the crisis. They won't have a job solving the problem if they fix it. It's just one of those clear, easy things that you just look at that's like, yeah, that problem gives me a job. So why would I ultimately want to fix it?
So, Mark, let me ask you this. If you could just guess for me what it costs to build a apartment unit per unit, not the apartment complex, not the building, but apartment in parts of California right now.
Per unit, I would guess $350,000.
$1 million. I have I
have 3x, and I kept crimping it up in my head. I'm like, oh my gosh.
Yeah, I have photographs in my book, Nowhere to Live, of a housing project in California that costs $1 million a unit. But you have to understand the project. You kind of understand why. One, it's beachfront property, low income housing on beachfront property. And two, there's a big sign in front of it saying union made. Okay. Well, proudly built by the union. So there's union labor rules involved. And you and I, get the sticks and bricks, if we can get the land and if you can get the permits to build, good luck. You would build something like that for a quarter of that, 250,000 at most. But this isn't only one. There are other projects, 800,000 in LA area, $1 million. LA passed the measure. I talk about this in the book too, of $1.2 billion to solve that price. This is about 10 years ago. But if you do the math, you take 1.2 billion, you divide it by you only have 1,200 units for apartments. So maybe you can fit 3,000 people into that, and there's 60,000 homeless people on the streets of LA. I mean,
and it's 100,000 or so now, right? I mean, the tents are just lined up the streets, up and down the streets now.
But Gavin Newsom said he's going to keep them, so I have quite confidence in Governor Newsom to take care of the problem for us. He's ordered the homeless to be moved out. So next problem, please.
Yeah, he's just. I can't even with that guy. So, well, it's been a very pleasant conversation. It's been great. Thank you for sharing. I'd love for you to share your most recent victory, if you could, before we call it, because there's nothing like a good inspiration to go into the weekend. If you could give us a nice victory story about some case that you had litigated.
So let me tell you about the story of George Sheets. George, 73-year-old man, he has a wife and he has a grandson that he wanted to raise. He bought acres of property in rural El Dorado County, which is just east of Sacramento. And he wanted to put a manufactured home on this 10 acres of 1,858 square feet. Told by the county, though, that he has to pay a traffic impact fee of $23,400. And the fee was to improve traffic throughout the county. 10% of that was to improve a highway interchange on Interstate Highway 50, which is 5 miles by road from his property. So he objected to that, and the California court said pound sand, because the came up with this, the County Board of Supervisors, a legislative act, and the courts can't pass a legislative act. They have to defer to the legislature. And this kind of fee, $2,400 for traffic impact fee, is on top of course, fees for police, fees for fire, fees for parks, fees for
property,
lighting.
all the other taxes that you would get.
In California, typically, if you want to build a home or an apartment, you have fees between $20,000 and $158,000 per unit. So we challenged this. We said that we went to the Supreme Court, and our argument was the county can't impose this kind of fee unless the county can prove George Sheets is doing on his property is actually going to cause $23,400 impact on traffic, because we don't think the county can. The county had a big traffic study. The study itself showed that residential properties like this don't cause that big of a deal, but it did have other people like taxpayers or businesses, larger businesses, pay for this. And so the court agreed with us and said, no, George Sheets have to pay this fee unless and until the county can prove it. So it was a nice victory for 7-year-old George Sheets, this little guy that we represented for free at the Supreme Court. And we like to think that we have a court that understands the little guy like George Sheets. The property rights of somebody like George Sheets are important. And that's why I tell Sheets' story in my book, Nowhere to Live, The Hidden Story of America's Housing Crisis, and a lot of others like that. The most recent victory that we've had at the Supreme Court. And, I feel really good about that because it's a tremendous favor for George. And we also, for many, many other people, are facing these exorbitant fees in California for trying to simply build homes. We want to get out of the crisis. We need to allow private individuals to build homes on their property that the people of California want to live in, or in the rest of the nation for that matter.
I've even heard stories that they're trying to get people for taxes for leaving the state. They're going to still.
That's a proposal. That's a proposal to have an exit tax that leave the state, you have to pay maybe 10% of your net wealth to the California government because California so much.
Because you're leaving. Of course, why wouldn't you have to pay them to leave? Why wouldn't you?
Hotel California, right? You can check in, but you can never leave without paying a huge amount of money.
It's beautiful. Well, thank you so much for this conversation, James. Welcome to the Not Conscious family. If you have any closing words, any way we could contact you or connect with you, please feel free to share all your connections, social media, your websites, and all your other information, as well as your book.
Absolutely. Yeah. So if you want to work, in the many cases Pacific Legal Foundation has, I said we've had 18 victories at the Supreme Court, 20 over their 50 years of existence. Check us out, pacificlegal.org. You can find all about us there, and we're a nonprofit, and you can figure out how that works as well. And if you're interested in my new book that's coming out on August 13th, Nowhere to Live, The Hidden Story of America's Housing Crisis, we have a website, nowheretolive.org, or you can just go to Amazon or any one of those places to find advanced copies of the book. I think open your eyes. I write it in layman's language. I don't write it just for attorneys. It goes into some of the history of the early cases of rent control after the Civil War, some of the early cases dealing with zoning when we had the first cases which were to make it a crime for a Black person to move into a white neighborhood or vice versa. So kinds of fascinating stories that most people haven't heard of, but I think you'll find it really interesting. Nowheretolive.org or pacificlegal.org.
Excellent. I will definitely put those up in the show notes as well. So thank you again for sharing your Friday afternoon with us. I know it's probably been a crazy week for you, and I hope you have yourself a great weekend.
Thank you, Mark. It's great being with you.
Thank you so much. We'll talk again soon. Take care.
1, 2, 3, 4. Good night, sweetheart. Well, it's time to go. Good night, sweetheart. Well, it's time to go. I hate to leave you, but I really must say Good night, sweetheart. Good night.